Well, greetings all. My colleague Dexter and I are delighted and honored to be with you here today for this very timely and important event. I must admit that it is somewhat humbling to speak with you all on the topic of COVID-19, given Korea's exemplary performance during the crisis so far relative to most other countries. Nevertheless, we hope to bring you in our presentation with some new ideas and points of inspiration related to strategic foresight. In particular, we want to focus on how you may wish to use foresight to make Korea's COVID recovery and long-term strategy more future ready. So first, a brief introduction to us and our work. As you know, the OECD is an international organization that works to build better policies for better lives. Our goal is to shape policies that foster prosperity, equality, opportunity, and well-being for all. We draw on almost 60 years of experience and insights to better prepare the world of tomorrow. The OECD's Strategic Foresight Unit is based out of the Office of the Secretary General. Our mandate is to strengthen the use of foresight and futures thinking across the OECD and its many areas of policy analysis. We also build collaboration and foresight capacity with governments around the world, and we help to bring long-term futures perspectives into global dialogue on key issues. So the pictures that you see here represent how our work looked before the COVID-19 crisis. And of course, this is how our work looks now. So what is strategic foresight? And I believe you've heard some of this already from our colleagues, Sohail and Clem and Nancy. But just to review, at the OECD, we view this as an approach to think systematically about the future in order to inform decision-making in the present. For us, this is mostly not about predictions or forecasts. We recognize the fundamental uncertainty of the future and therefore the impossibility of making accurate predictions for the medium or long term. Rather, strategic foresight is about exploring and preparing for a wide variety and diversity of possible future scenarios. Now, why do we do this? And how can foresight help to strengthen public policy in particular? Well, foresight can help governments and organizations in designing more resilient, agile, and adaptive policies. And it can do this really in three important ways. First, it helps us to identify changes that are emerging on the horizon and the new opportunities and challenges that those changes could create. Secondly, foresight helps us to spur innovative thinking on new policy solutions. By thinking through new opportunities and challenges, it helps us to imagine what could the solutions be that would be necessary to address those. And finally, it helps us to stress test our policies against a wide range of different possible future scenarios. Why now? Well, we would argue that while foresight has always been important, in times of great uncertainty, such as what we are seeing now, effective and responsible policymaking requires strategic foresight. Foresight is not a luxury, something that can be just done on the side of public policymaking. It's really a core essential requirement in our times for due diligence and for effective public policymaking. This really involves three core steps and elements. First of all, it means engaging proactively with the future, taking the time to look beyond the present and explore what could be coming. That's the first step. The second is really about moving beyond the expected future or the used future, as Sohail was describing it, and forcing ourselves to imagine and prepare for the unexpected, a wide diversity of possible future scenarios. And thirdly, it means bringing that back and using it to design adaptive, forward-looking strategies for action. So I will now turn to my colleague Dexter, who will tell you a bit more specifically about the strategic foresight work for the COVID-19 crisis, and in particular for beyond. Dexter?
Thank you so much, Duncan. So foresight was used in a number of very valuable ways throughout the COVID-19 pandemic. And we wanted to highlight a few shining examples from our government foresight community. The first one was Finland, where the Parliamentary Committee for the Future mobilized a rapid knowledge response to address some of the key uncertainties that Finland's policymakers had around the crisis. And then they moved on to developing products on looking into the short, medium, and long-term implications of COVID. Another example was Singapore, where there were foresight workshops organized for policymakers, analyzing how COVID had altered existing trends. And then there was a bunch of issue-oriented policy briefs developed that helped develop a more resilient government response. And then that brings us to some of the work that the OECD did using foresight during the COVID pandemic. So our team put together a report on strategic foresight for the COVID crisis and beyond. Explored some of the key uncertainties in multiple systems. It looked into possible unexpected developments and then into a wide range of their policy implications. And we really designed this report to inform the policy response, but also to start thinking about the long term and the recovery and beyond. And that really brings us to what we wanted to talk about today. We see a lot of room for strategic foresight to be embraced in the recovery process. This is again something that we're seeing picked up among our government foresight colleagues. The European Commission has said that foresight is essential to their view of resilience. It's something that they're going to be integrating into major policy areas related to their recovery initiatives. And they see foresight as essential to the process of twinning the green and digital transition that they hope to have in the coming years. Another good example from our government foresight community was Spain, which set out a vision for 2050 for their recovery funding, recognizing how transformational this moment of recovery is. And so these are a good introduction to the work the OECD is doing in future-proofing recovery strategies, as best as that can be done. So we believe that future-ready recovery strategies are stress-tested against multiple plausible future scenarios, and we're gonna tease and get into a few of those today. We believe future-ready recoveries are systems-oriented and holistic to avoid some of the policy silos that can hold back effective responses. And of course, they are aligned with long-term objectives, long-term objectives around things like sustainability and social responsibility. Future-ready recoveries need to include rigorous analysis of a number of plausible and possible future developments. A couple of those that we're thinking very deeply about are, what if deglobalization accelerates? So this crisis has shown some of the vulnerabilities in global value and supply chains. And we're looking at the possibility that we might see movements towards more local production and greater circular economy initiatives, something that is certainly the case in Europe right now. And this might mean a movement away from global trade. This year has also seen heightened international tensions, especially around technology. And we think that this calls for leaders to prepare for a less digitally interconnected world in the coming years than many might expect. So that brings us to the first of our scenarios that we're hoping that governments test their strategies against. And this is the possibility of a multi-track world. This is a world where different parallel clusters emerge with different countries made up of different countries. And those might have very different systems and standards and values guiding direction. And they may have very different definitions of things like well-being and prosperity. This could present some real challenges if each cluster has their own dominant and largely equivalent firms and businesses that adapt to the regulatory and cultural standards of the specific areas, because that could mean that very few firms are able to successfully operate across multiple clusters. We're also thinking about the ways that a large-scale movement away from globalization and potentially significant distrust between different areas in the world could create some very serious challenges for addressing things such as climate change. And so we're using this scenario to ask a few questions, but one of the big ones is how do countries prepare themselves and position themselves to deal with a potentially much more deeply divided world? Some of the other interesting possible developments that we're looking at are how the crisis has been very hard on some businesses, but it's actually been a boost to some of the biggest businesses in the world. And we're wondering whether we could see further market concentration as very large firms with a global presence potentially become more dominant through the rise of things like e-commerce and cloud computing. And this crisis has also seen a shift towards more remote work. Naturally, we're joining this conference via video link. But beyond work, we're seeing far more cultural activities from concerts to religious activities to weddings, moving into the digital realm. It's kind of funny. Duncan and I actually have one of our coworkers is getting married on Zoom tomorrow. But on top of this, we're also seeing the development of technologies like augmented reality and virtual reality that could really accelerate some of this transition. So that brings us to our another one of our interesting scenarios about virtual worlds, which really looks at an acceleration in digitalization and how that could shake up how most people think about space and geography. So in this scenario, we're dealing with a concept called the metaverse, which is a big interconnected digital platform where potentially even a majority of human interaction for social and work could take place in 2035. In a world that is much more digital and much more virtual, there are some ways that diplomacy becomes more important, but also much more complex than it's ever been before, because you have very fluid relationships between states and platform companies and users, both as creators and as customers, that need to be very delicately managed. This could introduce a number of new policy issues relating to things like freedom of expression and participation in the virtual space, protections against harassment and misinformation and manipulation, the use of behavioral data, both by states and by companies. And this scenario also could change up a lot of how work currently takes place in a world that could be even more tech dominated than it already is. And so what we're using this scenario to do is to push policymakers to think about how different social and economic life could be in the medium to long term because of advances in technology. And then that gets us to some of the other developments that we're looking at that really delve into the major issues that could be coming up after the COVID crisis. These include multiple environmental challenges, and I think that there's been reference to those made in previous presentations about climate change and food scarcity and biodiversity loss. And there are challenges that could stem from exacerbated inequality in the world. We're also looking at the potential disruptive power for good and potentially in negative ways of renewed interest in space exploration from as many countries and companies start launching more satellites than ever before into orbit. There are also the potential implications of advances in artificial intelligence that could cause disruptions as well. And so this brings us to a third scenario that we're thinking about that we call vulnerable worlds. The last one is virtual worlds. So the vulnerable worlds scenario is where we're pushing policymakers and leaders to think about how humanity might soon be arriving at a precipice. So technological innovation could be progressing even faster. And we think that that could bring a number of benefits, but it could simultaneously generate some risks that require global collaboration, even more urgent global collaboration beyond what we've seen successfully done to date. So I mentioned a few of these before. There are risks of environmental emergencies, and but also the ways that solving some of these environmental emergencies could increase inequality and the social tensions that come with that. We're thinking about the risks of what is known as the Kessler syndrome, where collisions between satellites could knock out a bunch of the world, or a large proportion of the world's communication capacity. And there are obviously threats that come with it and disruptions that come with advances in artificial intelligence, and potentially even greater risks as we push towards things like artificial general intelligence. And so while we don't have time to delve into the details of all of these different threats today, what we're trying to show is that these scenarios push leaders to think about what forms of collaboration, especially outside of their borders, might be necessary to avoid catastrophic disasters, and how preparation for the next disaster or how to prepare for the next disaster if it's one that cannot be dealt with on a national basis only. And so all of our work here relates to building preparedness for uncertainty. There's a couple of questions that we're trying to push people to, and governments and policymakers and leaders to think about, which are, what are the possible future developments that could disrupt your government's COVID response, and especially its recovery plan in the short and medium term. We want, as a result of this, to get people thinking about the new challenges and opportunities that could emerge. And third, we want to be asking questions about what steps can be taken now to make policies more responsive and adaptable to a range of plausible futures. And to try to explain some of the answers to this, I'm going to turn it back over to Duncan.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Dexter. And first of all, I just want to emphasize that, as you know, none of these scenarios that Dexter described are forecasts or predictions, and they're certainly not prescriptions or recommendations. Rather, the point of these scenarios is simply to help us prepare and rehearse for different futures that might arise outside of our immediate control. So I'd like to emphasize in particular that we find ourselves now at a very important historical turning point. Governments around the world are poised to make unprecedented public investments in the coming years to assist with the recovery, as well as a number of important related policy reforms. These investments and reforms will have impacts for decades to come. Therefore, foresight is needed now more than ever to make sure that governments don't miss opportunities or make mistakes that could have long-term consequences. In particular, this means using strategic foresight for three main purposes. First of all, to align investments and reforms with long-term goals, such as sustainable, inclusive, and resilient growth. Second, to stress test policies against multiple alternative and potentially disruptive future scenarios. And finally, also to help strengthen the ongoing foresight capacity and anticipatory governance so that you are ready for the next big surprise. And it's this final point that I want to end on. How can Korea strengthen its use of strategic foresight for policymaking, and in particular for your long-term national strategy? So the OECD recently held its annual meeting of the Global Government Foresight Community, bringing together over 200 leading public sector foresight practitioners from around the world. At the final session, we identified 7 features of what we called world-class anticipatory governance system. And I should point out that even the top foresight governments in the world recognize that they still have much room for improvement. So I won't have time to go into detail, but I'd like to highlight two features. First, that in terms of practices, it's important to go beyond just occasional or sporadic foresight studies. Ideally, the best foresight and the best preparedness is built on an ongoing culture and ongoing practice of foresight. This means continually scanning the horizon and continually exploring new potential scenarios in order to be ready to feed them into policymaking whenever needed. And second, I would highlight that on process, it's important that one not only involve a small group of experts, rather one must extend the process beyond to engage political decision makers, civil society, and citizens. They all must be engaged in actively imagining future scenarios and their implications. So I've been asked to speak to some of the obstacles in achieving this, in building government foresight capacity. So here are just a few to begin with. First, there is the natural discomfort that we all feel when faced with uncertainty. And as foresight practitioners, we therefore need to help support participants to guide them through the process so that they don't feel overwhelmed. Second, there's the normal political challenge of building consensus around the future when, of course, there are significant debates and divisions within our society. But here, I believe that strategic foresight plays a very useful role, because I've seen countless times where by getting people to think 10, 15, 20 years out, they tend to move beyond their ideological positions or their institutional turf battles and really enter a new space where they can think creatively and possibly find points of commonality as well. Third, and especially in the public sector, I find we've noticed that there's often a professional reluctance to explore really disruptive or surprising future scenarios. As economists and social scientists, we're trained to focus primarily on past trends for which there is evidence, and to then extrapolate these forecasts into the future. However, it's important for us to work with these colleagues and to make the case that good analysis and good forward-looking policy requires making room for the unexpected. And of course, there's the ongoing challenge, finally, of short-term political pressures dominating over longer-term thinking. So we need to show that foresight is relevant for decisions today, and that there is in fact a strong political incentive to being prepared for the longer term and being able to demonstrate to the population that one's policies and strategies are future ready and prepared for the long term. So finally, I want to end by saying that we would like to extend the invitation to collaborate further with you on strategic foresight. There are many possibilities for this. One, for example, could be to collaborate on a foresight study on a key issue of common interest, such as some of those that were discussed by Dexter above. In particular, this could be in an area that you think would be a benefit from a global perspective and from the OECD's in-depth and interdisciplinary policy expertise. And with that, I'd just like to thank you very much, and we look forward to your questions, and please don't hesitate to be in touch.